Brooke Hogan explains why she chose not to attend his dad's funeral. Brooke Hogan is opening up about why she chose not to attend her late father Hulk Hogan's funeral. The late WWE superstar was laid to rest in a private funeral in Clearwater, Florida, on Tuesday, August 5, 12 days after he died of a heart attack at age 71 on July 24. The service took place at Sylvan Abbey Memorial Park and Funeral Home in Clearwater, the city where Hulk, born Terry Gene Bollea, had been living with his wife, Sky Daly. Guests including Kid Rock, Triple H, and Stephanie McMahon were in attendance, but Brooke, who hasn't been in contact with her father for the last 2 years, didn't go to the ceremony. Later on Tuesday, Brooke, 37, shared a message on Instagram explaining her decision not to attend, alongside multiple photos showing herself, her husband Stephen Alexi, 39, and their twins Oliver and Molly, whom they welcomed in January 2025 at the beach. 1 minute ago, the wrestling world was still reeling from the emotional images that emerged from Clearwater, Florida, a quiet, sunlit city now draped in an invisible shroud of grief. On August 5th, in the intimate chapel of Sylvan Abbey Memorial Park and Funeral Home, some of the biggest names in WWE history gathered to bid farewell to a legend. Terry Gene Bollea, known to generations as Hulk Hogan, the Immortal, the Showman, the man who made wrestling larger than life, had been laid to rest in a private service. The final chapter of his story closed just 12 days after a sudden cardiac arrest took him at the age of 71, shocking not only the wrestling community but millions of fans worldwide. Inside the chapel, the air was thick with the scent of white lilies and quiet whispers, with familiar faces like Kid Rock, Triple H, and Stephanie McMahon sitting in solemn silence. Yet, for all the power and presence in that room, there was one absence that drew more questions than any speech could answer. Hulk Hogan's eldest daughter, Brooke Hogan, was not there. For many who grew up watching the golden-haired powerhouse dominate WrestleMania stages, the image of Brooke standing beside her father, both smiling under the bright lights, was inseparable from his public persona. Their father-daughter bond had been immortalized on reality TV, red carpets, and countless candid interviews. And yet, on the day when the world said its final goodbye to Hulk Hogan, Brooke was nowhere to be seen. Instead, hours after the service concluded, she posted a series of photographs to Instagram, her husband Stephen Alexi, and their newborn twins, Oliver and Molly, sitting on a sandy beach under a bright Florida sun. The images were peaceful, almost idyllic, but the caption that accompanied them cut through the speculation and ignited a storm of conversation. "People grieve in many ways," she wrote. "This was mine." It was a statement that, on the surface, sounded simple. But to those who had followed the Hogan family over the years, the televised highs, the tabloid lows, the public reconciliations and quiet estrangements, it carried layers of unspoken history. Brooke and her father had reportedly not been in contact for the past 2 years, a rift that neither side publicly addressed in detail. Some close to the family said the distance was born out of personal disagreements. Others claimed it was a result of deeper wounds, never fully healed after years of public scrutiny. Now, in the wake of Hulk's sudden passing, the absence of his daughter at his funeral was not just noticed, it became a focal point of discussion, speculation, and, for some, judgment. Inside the chapel that morning, those who attended the service said the mood was heavier than the Florida heat outside. Sky Daly, Hulk's widow, sat near the front, her eyes fixed on the casket draped in white flowers and framed by photographs spanning decades of Hulk's life. Some images showed him as the fierce young competitor with the handlebar mustache and electric yellow gear. Others captured the man in quieter moments, laughing with friends backstage, holding his children, sitting in his Clearwater home with his beloved dogs. Triple H, dressed in a dark suit, stood at the lectern for part of the service, his voice breaking as he recounted memories of road trips, locker room banter, and the advice Hogan had given him early in his career. Stephanie McMahon, her hand resting on her husband's arm, offered her own tribute, a reminder that Hulk Hogan wasn't just a larger-than-life persona, but also a man who, for better or worse, had shaped the wrestling industry into what it is today. For those in attendance, it was a cathartic moment. But outside those walls, as news spread of Brooke's absence, a different conversation was unfolding. Fans flooded social media with divided reactions. Some defended her choice, pointing out that grief is personal, that funerals can be more about closure for the living than a necessity for the dead. Others were less forgiving, accusing her of disrespect, of letting personal grievances overshadow the moment to honor her father's legacy. The truth, as is often the case in families both famous and ordinary, was far more complex. By the time Brooke's post appeared online, the service had ended, and the attendees had quietly made their way to the cemetery grounds for a brief, private interment. The Florida sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the manicured lawns. Brooke's caption, paired with the serene images of her family on the beach, sent ripples through the media. Reporters who had been camped outside the memorial park all day now shifted their focus. What did she mean by "people grieve in many ways"? Was her absence a deliberate statement, a quiet protest, or simply a choice made for her own emotional well-being? Those close to her say that for Brooke, the decision had been agonizing. Over the past 2 years, her relationship with her father had fractured to the point where contact was rare and conversations, when they happened at all, were brief and tense. In interviews from years prior, Brooke had spoken candidly about growing up in the shadow of a man whose fame was both a blessing and a burden. The reality TV show, Hogan Knows Best, had given the world a front-row seat to their family life, but behind the playful banter and staged moments were real tensions that reality cameras could never fully capture. In recent years, Brooke had focused on her own path, her music, her marriage to former professional hockey player Stephen Alexi, and most recently, motherhood. When Oliver and Molly arrived in January 2025, they became her world. Friends say that after years of navigating the chaos that came with being Hogan's daughter, Brooke had finally found a kind of peace away from the spotlight. The day Hulk passed, July 24th, Brooke was at home in Michigan, holding her newborn twins. News of his cardiac arrest came in a phone call that she described to one friend as a punch to the chest. She had known, of course, that her father's health had been an ongoing concern, but the finality of the news still caught her off guard. For hours, she sat in silence, scrolling through old photos, rewatching videos, and replaying memories both joyful and painful. By evening, her phone was buzzing with messages from friends, fans, and reporters. She answered none of them. In the days that followed, as funeral arrangements were made in Clearwater, Brooke wrestled with the decision of whether to attend. For many, it would have been unthinkable to stay away. But for Brooke, the choice was tangled in years of complicated family history, wounds that couldn't be patched up in a single day, even one as monumental as this. Those close to her insist it wasn't about making a statement against her father or his widow. It wasn't about snubbing the WWE figures who had been part of his inner circle. It was about protecting her own heart in a moment when the emotions in that room would have been too heavy to bear. She didn't want the last memory of her father to be him in a casket, one confidant explained. She wanted her last memory to be something alive, something real, not a performance for people who might not understand the depth of what they went through. And so, on the day of the funeral, while the chapel in Clearwater filled with hushed voices and bowed heads, Brooke, her husband, and their children drove to the beach. There, under a clear blue sky, she held Oliver and Molly close, letting the waves drown out the noise of the world. She thought about her father, about the larger-than-life figure who had been both hero and heartache, and about the little girl she once was, looking up at him in awe. On Instagram, the photos she shared were carefully chosen, not in the sense of being staged, but in their quiet honesty. One showed Stephen holding both babies, the ocean stretching out behind them. Another captured Brooke smiling faintly at Oliver as he reached toward the water. There was no makeup, no glamour, no sign of the bright lights and glitz that had once surrounded her life. Just a family, together, trying to find peace in a week defined by loss. In her caption, she didn't reference the funeral directly, didn't address the headlines already swirling about her absence. Instead, She offered those 6 words: "People grieve in many ways. This was mine." The reaction was immediate. Some followers flooded the comments with support, sharing their own stories of skipping funerals for personal reasons, of finding closure in solitude rather than ceremony. Others were less sympathetic, framing her decision as selfish or disrespectful. But Brooke didn't respond to the criticism. For her, the statement had been made, and there was nothing more to say. As the hours passed, those close to the Hogan family noted that neither Sky Daily nor Hulk's son Nick Hogan made any public comment on Brooke's absence. In a world where every move is dissected and every silence analyzed, that in itself spoke volumes. Inside the wrestling community, the news of Brooke's decision sparked its own round of discussion. Some wrestlers who had known Hulk for decades understood completely. "Families are complicated," one veteran performer said. "We all put on a show in the ring, but outside of it, there's a lot people never see. If Brooke felt she couldn't be there, that's her call." Others admitted they were surprised. "It's hard to imagine not showing up," another wrestler reflected. But grief doesn't follow a rulebook. That sentiment echoed across social media as fans debated what they would have done in her place. Meanwhile, in Clearwater, the private service concluded with a final tribute. Kid Rock, a longtime friend of Hulk's, performed a stripped-down acoustic version of a song the two had shared backstage during WWE events, a quiet nod to the man behind the persona. Triple H and Stephanie McMahon stood near the casket, speaking quietly with Sky before she placed her hand gently on the polished wood and whispered something only she could hear. As pallbearers carried Hulk's casket toward the waiting hearse, the crowd outside, a mix of invited guests and longtime fans, stood in respectful silence. Some wore vintage Hulkamania shirts. Others simply bowed their heads. The man who had once told an arena of 90,000 fans to say your prayers and take your vitamins was leaving the stage for the last time. But for Brooke, the farewell was different. As the sun began to set over the beach where she sat, she closed her eyes and let the sound of the waves fill her mind. She thought about the moments that had defined her father, the roaring crowds, the towering frame, the unmistakable voice, but also the quiet ones, watching movies together, talking about music, the way he would call her Brookie in that playful tone. She imagined him walking down the beach toward her, the sand shifting under his bare feet, smiling in that larger-than-life way. In her heart, she said goodbye. Not in a chapel, not under the eyes of the public, but here, in a place where the noise of the world couldn't touch her. For Brooke Hogan, this was grief. Not a single ceremony, but a deeply personal journey, one that would continue long after the flowers at Sylvan Abbey had wilted and the headlines had faded. And in that quiet decision, she reminded the world of something many forget, that grief is not a performance. It is not a measure of love counted by attendance or absence. It is, as she wrote, something deeply individual. People grieve in many ways, and sometimes, the most loving goodbye is the one said in private. The truth about Brooke Hogan's decision not to attend her father's funeral cannot be understood without going back to the last 2 years, a period of silence, tension, and unspoken wounds that quietly redefined their relationship. The public might have seen Hulk Hogan in interviews, smiling and speaking warmly of family, but behind the scenes, the connection between father and daughter had fractured. It wasn't one single fight that caused it, but a slow accumulation of moments. Disagreements over life choices, business conflicts, differences in personal values that eventually made their conversations rare and their visits non-existent. Brooke had always been fiercely independent, determined to carve out her own identity beyond being Hogan's daughter, but it was precisely that independence that sometimes clashed with her father's larger-than-life persona. In a family where fame was both a lifeline and a trap, boundaries were hard to maintain. For Brooke, the break was not an easy one. Friends close to her say she agonized over it at the time, questioning whether stepping back was an act of self-preservation or betrayal. She had grown up in an environment where personal struggles were never entirely private, where reality television blurred the line between authenticity and performance, and where family disputes could easily become headlines. By the time she met Stephen Alexi and began building a life in Michigan, she had learned the value of distance. She found peace in small-town rhythms, away from the constant pulse of media attention. And yet, no matter how far she moved, the shadow of her father's fame was never far behind. When Hulk Hogan died on July 24, 2025, from a sudden cardiac arrest, the news shattered the wrestling world, but it also cracked open memories Brooke had carefully placed in the back of her mind. That day, she didn't cry immediately, not because she didn't feel the loss, but because the shock was numbing. It wasn't until later that night, holding one of her newborn twins as they drifted to sleep, that the tears came. They came quietly, without warning, as she remembered being a little girl sitting on her father's shoulders at the beach, his laughter loud and unapologetic. She remembered him teaching her to drive, coaching her on stage presence, even encouraging her music career despite knowing the weight his name carried in every review and headline. These moments of warmth tangled with memories of strain. Arguments about trust, painful disagreements, times when misunderstandings widened the distance between them. In the days following his death, the Hogan family began preparing for the funeral in Clearwater. For many, it was simply assumed Brooke would be there. Even those who knew of the estrangement believed the gravity of the moment might bring her back. But as the arrangements became more concrete, Brooke's resolve solidified. She didn't see her absence as a statement of anger, nor as an act of defiance. It was, in her mind, a choice to preserve her own emotional stability and, perhaps, in a way, to honor her father in the only way she could on her terms. Attending would have meant walking into a room filled with memories, unresolved questions, and people who knew only fragments of their story. It would have meant performing grief under the gaze of people who might misinterpret every glance, every tear, or lack thereof. For Brooke, that was not grief. It was a stage, and she had spent enough of her life on stages. Instead, she created her own farewell. On the morning of August 5th, while the pallbearers in Clearwater prepared to carry her father's casket, Brooke and Stephen bundled their twins into the car and drove to the shoreline. The beach was quiet, save for the gulls and the rhythmic crash of waves. The air was warm, the sky cloudless, the kind of Florida day her father would have loved. She sat in the sand, her legs tucked under her, watching Oliver and Molly's tiny hands grasp at seashells. As the hours passed, she let the sound of the ocean take the place of eulogies. There were no speeches here, no floral arrangements, no cameras. Only the sea, the sun, and the private thoughts she would never share with anyone else. Later that afternoon, when she posted the beach photos to Instagram with her brief caption, "People grieve in many ways. This was mine." She knew the reaction would be polarizing. She understood that for some, grief is measured by presence, by visible acts of respect. But Brooke believed grief was something deeper, something that couldn't always be witnessed. For her, this was not avoidance, it was acceptance in her own way. She was not the type to explain herself to the court of public opinion, and so she didn't. The statement stood alone, open to interpretation. As the media dissected her choice, more details from inside the funeral service began to emerge. Those who attended described an intimate gathering of about 50 people, each given a moment to share a story about Hulk. Kid Rock, wearing a simple black jacket instead of his usual stage attire, spoke about their decades-long friendship, his voice breaking at the mention of how Hulk could light up a room even on his worst days. Triple H remembered the first time Hulk offered him advice backstage, telling him, "Kid, the moves matter, but the moments are what people remember." Stephanie McMahon, fighting back tears, spoke of Hulk's impact on wrestling's global reach, crediting him with bringing WWE into living rooms worldwide in the 80s and 90s. And through all of it, the absence of Brooke was felt, even if it wasn't openly acknowledged. Some attendees quietly expressed understanding. "It's not my place to judge," one former WWE superstar said afterward. Family dynamics are complicated, especially in this business. We all have our reasons for doing what we do, and grief doesn't follow the same script for everyone. Others, however, admitted they were surprised, even hurt, by her choice. "I just wish she could have been here," said another guest. For closure, for the family, for herself. In Clearwater that evening, as the sun set over Sylvan Abbey Memorial Park, the crowd outside the gates began to disperse. Inside the cemetery, the final moments of the service were quiet, reserved only for those closest to Hulk in his last years. Sky Daly remained by his graveside long after the others had gone, her hand resting on the polished surface of the casket. Nick Hogan stood nearby, his head bowed, his expression unreadable. The world had lost an icon, but here, the loss was not about titles or championships. It was about a father, a husband, a friend. Hundreds of miles away, on a different stretch of sand, Brooke was watching the horizon. The twins had fallen asleep in their stroller, and Stephen sat beside her, their hands loosely intertwined. She thought about the funeral she hadn't attended, the faces she hadn't seen, the words she hadn't spoken. She wondered if her father would understand her choice, or if he'd see it as distance in his final chapter. She hoped he'd remember her for the times they laughed, for the songs they sang together, for the moments when love outweighed the no. That night, after putting Oliver and Molly to bed, Brooke scrolled through social media. She saw the headlines: Brooke Hogan absent from father's funeral, family rift keeps daughter away, Brooke chooses beach over goodbye. She read the comments, some supportive, others cruel, and then she put the phone down. She poured herself a glass of water, sat on the porch, and let the stillness wrap around her. In that quiet, she found a strange kind of peace. The world could speculate all it wanted. She had said her goodbye in her own way, and that, she decided, would have to be enough. Because for Brooke Hogan, grief was not about proving love in front of others. It was about holding onto the truth of her relationship with her father, the good, the bad, and the in-between, and letting that truth be hers alone. And in that, she honored him in the most personal way she knew how. In the days after Hulk Hogan was laid to rest, the wrestling world couldn't stop talking about Brooke Hogan's absence from the funeral. For some, the conversation was laced with disappointment. For others, it was tempered with empathy. WWE legends, journalists, and lifelong fans each had their own take, but regardless of opinion, her choice had become as much a part of the story as the funeral itself. Every major wrestling podcast dedicated entire segments to dissecting what it meant. Some hosts took a hardline stance, saying that no matter the personal history, family funerals are sacred moments that should not be missed. Others pushed back, arguing that no one outside the family could possibly understand the complexities at play, especially given the decades of fame, public scrutiny, and private tension that the Hogan family had endured. Within the WWE locker room, conversations about Brooke's decision were more measured. Many current and former wrestlers, who knew firsthand how fame distorts family life, defended her right to grieve on her own terms. A few even privately admitted that they might have made the same choice if they had been in her position. "The cameras don't stop when you're famous," one retired superstar explained. "Even at funerals, someone is always watching, waiting for a moment to freeze in time. If you're not ready for that, if you know you can't handle it, maybe staying away is the braver choice." Still, the image of the service without her was hard for some to shake. In the wrestling business, family bonds are celebrated and mythologized, sometimes even more than in real life. Hulk Hogan himself had built his legacy not just on the back of his in-ring accomplishments, but on the persona of the larger-than-life hero who fought for family values and inspired loyalty. To see his own daughter absent from his final farewell felt, to some, like an emotional contradiction. It was this dissonance that kept the topic alive on social media, with thousands of comments debating whether Brooke's absence was an act of selfishness or self-preservation. For Brooke, the noise was inescapable. Even though she avoided direct engagement with the criticism, the headlines and hot takes found their way to her. It was a strange feeling to be at the center of a national conversation, not for a new album, a TV appearance, or a career move, but for a deeply personal choice about how to say goodbye to her father. Some of the harshest criticism came from fans who still saw her as an extension of Hulk Hogan's brand, unable to separate her from the image of the smiling daughter who once stood ringside in Hulkamania colors. Those fans wanted the narrative to end with the perfect image, Brooke tearfully embracing her father's casket or standing between WWE legends as they honored him. But Brooke wasn't interested in feeding a storybook ending that didn't reflect reality. Ironically, her decision sparked a broader discussion about grief within the wrestling community, a topic rarely addressed in such public detail. Several wrestlers opened up in interviews about how they had handled the loss of family members, revealing that many had skipped funerals themselves because of tour schedules, strained relationships, or an inability to face the moment. What had once been whispered about in private was now being discussed openly, and Brooke's absence became a kind of case study in how grief defies public expectations. Some fans began to soften their stance, recognizing that love and loss can exist even when the rituals look different. Back in Clearwater, as the days passed and flowers faded at Sylvan Abbey Memorial Park, Sky Daly and Nick Hogan kept a low profile. Neither gave interviews, nor did they comment publicly on Brooke's choice. Sources close to the family suggested there was no animosity, at least not on their part, over her absence. "It's been a hard few years for all of them," one insider said. "This wasn't a situation where anyone wanted to draw battle lines. Everyone is just trying to process the loss in their own way." For the wrestling press, however, the story was too compelling to leave alone. Articles speculating about the Hogan family dynamic surged across websites, with some revisiting the last 2 years of Brooke's public appearances and statements in an attempt to piece together the reasons for the estrangement. Old clips from Hogan Knows Best resurfaced, spliced together with recent footage of Hulk's interviews about his personal life. The juxtaposition was jarring, a reminder of how quickly relationships can shift over time and how little the public truly knows about what happens behind closed doors. Brooke, meanwhile, stayed rooted in her new life in Michigan. Her focus was entirely on Steven and their twins, who were now nearly 8 months old. Friends say she spent more time outdoors, often taking the babies to local parks or quiet lockshores, perhaps as a way to recreate the peace she had felt on the beach the day of the funeral. She spoke sparingly about her father, usually in private conversations with people she trusted. When she did, it wasn't with bitterness, but neither was it with romanticized nostalgia. She seemed determined to remember him as he truly was to her, not just the legend who headlined WrestleMania, but the man whose love, flaws, and humanity were as real as any other father's. Even so, the media's fixation on her absence forced her to confront the reality that her public image had changed. In some corners, she was now seen as the daughter who didn't show up. In others, she was quietly admired for setting a boundary in the face of overwhelming pressure. The shift was subtle, but Brooke felt it. She had been famous for most of her life, but this was one of the first times she had been defined not by what she had done, but by what she hadn't. That label, chosen or not, was something she knew she would carry for a long time. Interestingly, the WWE itself remained silent on the matter. There was no official statement, no on-air acknowledgement of her absence. On the following episode of Monday Night Raw, Hulk Hogan was honored with a 10-bell salute and a highlight reel of his most iconic matches. The tribute aired without mention of family, focusing entirely on his career and his impact on the industry. Fans in the arena wore vintage Hulkamania shirts, some holding up handmade signs with messages like, "Thanks for the memories," and "Forever the champ." It was a celebration of his public legacy, untouched by the personal complexities that had played out away from the ring. In private, however, the divide between Hulk's wrestling family and his biological family lingered. While some within WWE still hoped Brooke might make a future appearance at a public tribute or Hall of Fame ceremony, others believed her choice not to attend the funeral was a signal that she would remain apart from those moments. For Brooke, that decision hadn't been made yet, but she knew that if she ever did appear at such an event, it would have to be on her own terms, not as a prop in someone else's narrative. As summer began to fade, the conversation about her absence gradually quieted. Other wrestling stories took over the headlines. New feuds emerged on television, championship belts changed hands, and the constant churn of the industry moved forward. But for those who had watched the Hogan family for decades, the image of that day in Clearwater, the flowers, the tributes, the familiar faces gathered under one roof, would always have an empty seat in the front row. And for Brooke, the image she would carry was entirely different. A wide stretch of beach, the salt air on her skin, her twins asleep beside her, and the knowledge that her goodbye had been spoken in silence, far from the world's gaze. Whether the public ever fully understands her choice or not, Brooke Hogan knows it was the right one for her. And as she moves forward, that understanding, her own private truth, will matter far more than the opinions of those who only knew her father from the bright lights of the ring. Because for all the noise and speculation, the lesson she took from this chapter is one she will keep for the rest of her life. That grief is not a performance, and closure does not require an audience. In the weeks that followed her father's funeral, Brooke Hogan found herself navigating a strange kind of limbo, caught between the private reality of her grief and the public's lingering fascination with her absence. The initial flurry of headlines had died down, replaced by the usual churn of wrestling news and celebrity gossip, but the undertow of curiosity never truly faded. People still stopped her in public, at the grocery store, at a local coffee shop, not to offer condolences, but to ask the question she had come to dread: why weren't you there? Some asked it kindly, others with the sharp edge of judgment. And while she never felt the need to justify herself, she quickly learned that silence, too, could be misinterpreted. Privately, Brooke was doing what she had promised herself she would do after her father's passing: focus entirely on her new family. Her days were filled with feedings, diaper changes, and the gentle chaos of raising twins. Yet, amid the routines, her mind often drifted to him. She thought about the contradictions of his life. The man who could command a stadium's attention with a single flex of his biceps, yet struggled to find the right words in a quiet conversation at home. She thought about the advice he had given her when she was young, the kind that sounded like wrestling promos, but often carried a deeper truth: you gotta believe you're the best before anyone else will. That bravado, she realized, wasn't just for the cameras, it was how he survived decades in an industry that could chew people up and spit them out. At night, when the twins were asleep, Brooke began going through old boxes she had brought with her when she moved away from Florida. There were scrapbooks from her childhood, VHS tapes of her father's matches, and photographs from a life that now felt like someone else's. One image in particular stopped her cold: a candid shot of her and her father sitting on the edge of a hotel pool somewhere on the road. She was maybe 8 years old, wearing an oversized Hulkamania shirt, her legs dangling in the water. He was leaning toward her, saying something that had clearly made her laugh. She couldn't remember what it was, but she remembered the feeling that in that moment, it was just them. No cameras, no fans, no pressure. Just a dad and his little girl. It was in those quiet hours that Brooke began to think about how she might honor her father's legacy on her own terms. She knew she wouldn't be returning to the WWE spotlight. Her life now was far removed from the chaos of that world, but she also didn't want her absence at the funeral to be the only thing people remembered about her connection to him. The idea came slowly, at first as a thought she pushed aside, then as something she began to sketch out in a notebook: a foundation dedicated to supporting the children of wrestlers and entertainers, kids who had grown up in the glare of fame and often paid a hidden price for it. She had lived that life herself, and she knew how isolating it could be. Helping others navigate it felt like a way to transform her own complicated history into something meaningful. But honoring her father also meant confronting the parts of their relationship that had been left unresolved. There were apologies never spoken, misunderstandings never cleared. Brooke knew those things would never be fixed now, and that acceptance was its own form of grief. She decided she would write him a letter anyway, one he would never read, not to send it into the world, but to let the words out of her. Over several nights, she filled pages with memories, regrets, and gratitude. She told him she loved him. She told him she wished they had found a way back to each other sooner. And she told him, without bitterness, that she hoped he had found the peace in death that had so often eluded him in life. When the letter was finished, she took it to the same beach where she had said her goodbye on the day of the funeral. The twins were with Stephen, and for the first time in weeks, she was alone. She walked to the edge of the water, let the waves touch her toes, and read the letter aloud into the wind. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, it steadied. When she was done, she folded the pages and let them go into the surf. The paper darkened as it soaked, then drifted away, pulled by the tide. She stood there until it was out of sight, feeling lighter in a way she hadn't expected. In the days that followed, Brooke didn't tell anyone about the letter. It wasn't meant to be a grand gesture or a public spectacle. It was just for her and for him, wherever he might be now. But the act seemed to shift something in her. The sting of the criticism over her absence began to dull. She no longer felt the need to defend herself because she knew she had found her own closure. And closure, she realized, is not a one-size-fits-all thing. Some find it in funerals. Others find it in rituals no one else will ever see. As summer gave way to fall, Brooke began making small steps toward her foundation idea. She reached out to a few trusted friends in the industry, people who understood both the spotlight and its shadows. The response was immediate and encouraging. Several offered to help fund the project, others to contribute their time or share their stories. Slowly, she began to see a path forward, one where her father's name might live on, not just in the history books of wrestling, but in something tangible that helped people in real, lasting ways. The public may never fully understand why Brooke Hogan chose not to attend her father's funeral. And maybe they don't need to. What matters is that she found a way to honor him that was authentic to who she is now, not the reality TV daughter, not the tabloid headline, but the woman she has become. A woman who loves her father, even with the distance, even with the flaws, and who refuses to let the world dictate how she should express that love. In the end, her grief was hers alone, and that was enough. The world had seen Hulk Hogan as the immortal hero, the champion, the showman. Brooke had seen him as something far more complicated, her dad. And that, above all, was the man she said goodbye to, not in a chapel filled with flowers and cameras, but in the quiet rhythm of the waves, with the words only she would ever know. In the final measure of it all, Brooke Hogan's decision to stay away from her father's funeral stands as one of those moments that reveals as much about the living as it does about the dead. To the outside world, Hulk Hogan's farewell in Clearwater was a definitive, historic event. A congregation of wrestling's biggest names, a hushed gathering of those who had shared his journey from the locker rooms of small-town arenas to the thunder of WrestleMania main events. But for Brooke, the truest farewell could never have been compressed into a single service. Her grief did not fit neatly into the frame of a ceremony. It stretched across decades, tangled in memories too personal for public view, shaped by both the love and the fractures that defined their bond. In her own way, Brooke understood the gravity of her father's legacy. She knew the world saw him as a symbol, a man whose charisma and physical presence had transcended wrestling to become a piece of pop culture history. She had been there for the roaring crowds, the backstage celebrations, the autograph signings where children's faces lit up as if they'd just met a real-life superhero. But she had also been there for the quieter truths. The exhaustion after long tours, the pressure to maintain an image, the toll fame took on private relationships. She had seen the man behind the mustache, with all his complexities and contradictions, and it was that man she chose to remember in her own way. Her absence from the funeral did not mean absence from mourning. While others stood in rows before his casket, Brooke stood barefoot in the sand, letting the Atlantic wind carry her goodbye into the horizon. Where they heard speeches and eulogies, she heard the timeless rhythm of waves that had rolled in long before either of them was born. Where they bowed their heads under the weight of loss, she lifted her face to the sky and remembered the moments that had been theirs alone, not to be shared, not to be performed, but to be held close as part of the complicated truth of a father and daughter. In the months that followed, Brooke's focus shifted toward what came next. The foundation she envisioned began to take shape, not as a memorial to Hulk Hogan's public persona, but as a testament to the unseen lives touched by fame, the children who, like her, had grown up in its glare. It was an act of love, not only for her father, but for those who might find in her story a kind of validation, a reminder that it's possible to carry both pride and pain in equal measure. She knew her father's name would open doors for the cause. She hoped her own journey would help keep them open. There will always be those who believe her choice was wrong, that presence at a funeral is a duty, not an option. And there will be others who understand, who know that grief is too personal to be dictated by tradition or public expectation. Brooke herself no longer concerns herself with which side people take. She has learned that closure is not something granted by ceremony or consensus, it is something claimed, often quietly and guarded fiercely. When history remembers Hulk Hogan, it will remember the roaring entrances, the victories, the larger-than-life persona that inspired generations. When Brooke remembers him, it will be with the fullness of their story, the laughter, the lessons, the distance, and the reconciliation she found not in his final days, but in her own heart after he was gone. Her goodbye was not the one the cameras captured, but it was the one that was real for her. And in the end, that is the only goodbye that matters. For Brooke Hogan, the measure of love was never going to be proven by a seat in the front row or a tear caught on camera. It was proven by the life she's building now, a life grounded in authenticity, in quiet acts of remembrance, and in the unwavering choice to grieve on her own terms. Her father once told her, "You've gotta live like you mean it, kid." And perhaps, in her own way, she's doing exactly that. Living, grieving, and honoring him not by following the script the world expected, but by writing her own. Sometimes it came while watching her husband rock one of the twins to sleep, the soft rhythm reminding her of being a child in her father's arms. Other times it struck while passing a store window and catching sight of a vintage Hulkamania shirt, the red and yellow a sudden flash of memory. She let those moments come and go without fighting them, understanding now that grief was not something to conquer, but something to carry, a weight that shifts but never vanishes. In early spring, Brooke returned to Clearwater for the first time since her father's passing. It wasn't for a public event or a WWE appearance, but for something entirely her own. She visited the beach they had loved when she was young, the same one where she had said her private goodbye months earlier. The sand was warm under her feet, the gulls wheeling overhead, and the horizon seemed endless. She didn't visit his gravesite. Not because she was avoiding it, but because her connection to him was never in the stone or the flowers. It was in the salt air, in the roar of the surf, in the echo of his laugh carried on the wind. Standing there, she thought about the arc of her life, the girl who grew up under stadium lights, the young woman who tried to navigate reality TV fame, the daughter who had loved and clashed with her father in equal measure. And now, the mother who was determined to give her children something different, a life defined by presence, not performance. In that moment, she understood that her father's legacy was not just the championships, the catchphrases, or the pop culture moments. It was also the lessons learned from the mistakes, the awareness of how fame could both lift and break a family. And perhaps, in a way, her absence from the funeral had been a reflection of that, a refusal to turn grief into another performance. When she left the beach that day, Brooke didn't take anything with her, no shells, no photos, no souvenirs. What she carried instead was a renewed sense of purpose. The foundation was already gaining momentum, with its first charity event planned for later in the year. She had begun outlining a memoir, not as a tell-all about her family, but as a meditation on identity, resilience, and what it means to find yourself outside the shadow of a famous name. And she continued to pour her energy into her twins, who were now babbling their first words and taking unsteady steps. There was a time when Brooke might have wondered how history would judge her choice, when she might have been tempted to shape her actions around public perception. But that time had passed. Now, she measured her decisions against a simpler standard. Would they bring her peace? Would they honor her truth? If the answer was yes, she did not need the world's approval. Her father had once lived by the mantra, "Say your prayers and take your vitamins." Brooke's was quieter, less flashy, but no less powerful. Live in a way you can live with. And in that way, she honored him every day, not in the roar of a crowd, but in the quiet moments where love and memory meet. Because grief, she had learned, is not the end of the relationship. It's simply the form it takes after goodbye. And in the shifting tides of her own life, Brooke Hogan had found a way to keep her father close, even as she walked firmly forward into her own. By the summer of the following year, Beyond the Spotlight was no longer just an idea whispered among friends in the industry. It had become a visible force in the wrestling world and beyond. Brooke Hogan's foundation had officially launched with a mission that struck a chord not only with wrestling fans, but with anyone who had grown up in the shadow of a famous parent. Its message was simple but profound. The children of public figures deserve support, guidance, and a safe place to share their experiences without fear of judgment or exploitation. The first major fundraiser was held in Tampa, Florida, a deliberate choice by Brooke, both as a nod to the city's deep wrestling roots and as a subtle connection to her father's legacy, without making it about him entirely. The venue was a renovated warehouse-turned-event space, filled with photographs not of Hulk Hogan's matches, but of everyday life in the wrestling community. Kids sitting backstage doing homework while their parents wrestled, birthday parties in locker rooms, holiday dinners in hotel banquet halls. Brooke walked the floor greeting guests, some of whom were old family friends, others strangers who had been moved by the cause. She wasn't in sequins or in the spotlight. She wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled back, the focus firmly on the mission rather than herself. What surprised her most was how many former wrestlers and entertainers approached her with quiet gratitude. Some told her they'd carried guilt for years over the ways their careers had taken them away from their children. Others shared how hard it had been to explain to their kids why their family life didn't look like anyone else's. Brooke listened to every story, sometimes hugging the person in front of her, other times just holding their hand in shared understanding. These moments confirmed that her decision to create the foundation had been the right one. It wasn't about repairing her public image, and it certainly wasn't about rehashing her family's private history. It was about building something her father, for all his fame, had never been able to give her, a safety net for those navigating a world that was both glamorous and isolating. The press, which had once been fixated on her absence from her father's funeral, now began to shift its tone. Articles about Beyond the Spotlight highlighted the impact it was making: mental health resources for teenagers, career counseling for young adults, even emergency funds for families in crisis when a parent's career ended suddenly. WWE personalities began donating memorabilia for charity auctions, with the proceeds going directly to the foundation. Some even appeared at events, lending their star power to the cause without turning it into a spectacle. One particularly emotional moment came during a panel discussion at the event, when a teenage girl stepped up to the microphone. Her father had been a mid-card wrestler in the late 1990s, never reaching the fame of a Hulk Hogan, but still spending most of his life on the road. She spoke about how lonely it had been, how she had struggled in school because of constant moves, and how she often felt invisible compared to her father's persona in the ring. Through tears, she thanked Brooke for creating a place where she could finally talk about those feelings without fear of being told she was ungrateful. The room fell silent, then erupted into applause. Brooke, her voice breaking, simply told the girl, "You matter just as much as the spotlight ever did." These were the moments when Brooke felt closest to her father, not because she was following in his footsteps, but because she was building something new from the lessons his life had taught her. Hulk Hogan had taught her showmanship, confidence, and resilience, but he had also taught her, unintentionally, about the cost of living too long in a character. Beyond the Spotlight was, in many ways, her answer to that. As the foundation grew, so did Brooke's role as a public figure again, though this time on her terms. She gave interviews not about her father's controversies or her reality TV days, but about mental health, family dynamics, and the importance of supporting children in high-profile households. Wrestling podcasts invited her on to talk about the foundation, and while some inevitably asked about her absence from the funeral, the conversation almost always shifted to the work she was doing now. Slowly, the narrative began to change. She was no longer just the daughter who didn't attend the funeral. She was the daughter who built something lasting from her father's legacy. There were still days when grief surprised her. An old promo of her father would pop up online, or a fan would share a personal story about meeting him, and the familiar ache would return. But those moments no longer felt like open wounds. They felt like reminders that his life, for all its complexities, had meaning beyond the ring. And in her own way, she was carrying that forward. Not by copying his career, but by filling in the spaces his spotlight had never reached. The wrestling world began to embrace the foundation as part of its own evolving culture. WWE quietly partnered with Beyond the Spotlight for certain wellness initiatives, providing resources for current and retired talent with children. AEW wrestlers sent donations and offered to appear at events. Even independent promotions began inviting Brooke to speak at shows, not as a celebrity guest, but as an advocate for something the business had historically overlooked. In private, Brooke often wondered what her father would have thought of all this. She imagined him showing up at an event, shaking hands with the wrestlers, telling the kids in his trademark booming voice to believe in themselves. She imagined him teasing her for getting emotional on stage, then hugging her in that big, awkward way he always had. She knew there was no way to rewrite the past, but in these daydreams, she found a kind of healing, a way to keep him present in her life without reopening old wounds. And perhaps most importantly, the foundation was creating something she had longed for in her own childhood: community. The children and families it served were no longer isolated in their experiences. They were connected, understood, and supported. Brooke often said that if even one child avoided the loneliness she had felt, all the work would be worth it. In this way, Brooke Hogan's life after her father's death became less about a single choice she made on one August day, and more about the choices she was making every day since, to live with authenticity, to transform grief into action, and to ensure that the children of today's stars would have what she once needed most: a place where they could just be themselves. It was nearly 2 years after Hulk Hogan's passing when Brooke Hogan found herself stepping into a space she had never expected to occupy again: a WWE arena. Not as a performer, not as a guest on a reality show, but as the invited representative of Beyond the Spotlight, now a respected partner in WWE's wellness and family outreach programs. It was WrestleMania weekend in Orlando, and while she had been asked to participate in a panel discussion on mental health in the wrestling industry, Brooke knew that the audience for this event would include people she hadn't spoken to since before her father's death, people who had been part of his inner circle, some of whom she suspected still questioned her decision not to attend his funeral. The air inside the convention center was thick with the energy of fans and wrestlers, moving between autograph tables, photo ops, and charity booths. Brooke's panel was tucked into a quieter corner of the fan access event, away from the chaos, but still close enough that the low hum of excitement was ever present. As she sat down at the long table alongside 2 other panelists, both retired wrestlers who had become vocal advocates for mental health, she scanned the audience. And that's when she saw them. Triple H and Stephanie McMahon were standing near the back, not as formal guests, but as listeners. Brooke felt her stomach tighten. The last time she had seen them was in Clearwater, at her father's funeral, or rather, she hadn't seen them, because she hadn't been there. She wondered if they would come up afterward, or if they'd simply leave without saying anything. The panel began, and Brooke threw herself into the discussion. She spoke candidly about the challenges of growing up in a wrestling family, the missed birthdays, the constant travel, the invisible weight of public expectation. She didn't mention her father's name, but his presence lingered between her words, as if each point she made was a thread tying her work to the lessons she had learned from both the bright and shadowed parts of his life. When it was over, the applause was warm and genuine. As the crowd began to disperse, Brooke gathered her notes, bracing herself for a polite nod from Triple H or perhaps nothing at all. Instead, she looked up to see Stephanie McMahon walking toward her. She smiled, not the stiff, performative smile of corporate WWE events, but something softer, more personal. That was powerful, Stephanie said, taking a seat beside her. Your dad, he would have been proud of this. The words hit Brooke harder than she expected. Before she could respond, Triple H approached, extending his hand. I didn't get it before, he admitted, his voice low. Why you weren't there that day? But I think I do now. This, he gestured toward the foundation banner behind her. This is how you said goodbye. They talked for nearly 20 minutes, not about wrestling storylines or business, but about her father as they had each known him. There were moments of laughter, remembering his larger-than-life antics backstage, and moments of shared silence when they touched on the more difficult parts of his journey. Brooke realized, with a quiet sense of relief, that any lingering tension had been replaced by something closer to understanding. Over the next year, that understanding deepened. Members of her father's old circle began reaching out. Kid Rock sent a personal donation to Beyond the Spotlight, writing in his note, for the kids who grow up watching the world watch their parents. Even Sky Daly, Hulk's widow, made contact, inviting Brooke to meet privately in Clearwater. It was a delicate meeting, but one that ended with an embrace and the acknowledgement that while their relationships with Hulk had been different, they had both loved him in their own ways. The most unexpected moment of reconciliation came when WWE proposed holding a special memorial segment for Hulk Hogan during the Hall of Fame ceremony, marking the anniversary of his induction decades earlier. They wanted Brooke to be the one to speak. The request stirred up a whirlwind of emotions. The thought of standing in front of an arena full of fans, of speaking about a man whose legacy was both monumental and complicated, was daunting. But in the end, she said yes. When the night arrived, Brooke walked onto the stage at the Amway Center to a standing ovation. She stood at the podium, the massive screen behind her showing a montage of her father's most iconic moments in the ring. For a moment, she just looked at the images. The poses, the flexes, the electric energy of crowds chanting his name, and then she began to speak. She didn't shy away from the complexities. She talked about the highs and the lows, about how her father had taught her to be strong, but also shown her the cost of carrying that strength alone. She thanked the wrestling community for keeping his memory alive, and she spoke directly to the fans about the importance of seeing the human being behind the performer. And then, in a voice that was steady but thick with emotion, she said, I didn't stand in the front row at his funeral. But I carry him with me every day, in the work I do and in the life I live. That's how I honor him. And I think, in his own way, he'd understand. The crowd rose again, this time not just for Hulk Hogan, but for the daughter who had found her own way to keep his spirit alive. When she left the stage, several of her father's old colleagues embraced her. Some with tears in their eyes, others with the quiet nods that speak more than words ever could. That night, as Brooke sat backstage watching the rest of the ceremony, she realized the reconciliation hadn't been about erasing the past. It had been about accepting it, about finding common ground in their shared love for a man who had meant something different to each of them. And in that acceptance, she felt lighter, not because the grief was gone, but because it no longer felt like something she had to carry alone. It was a crisp Florida morning when Brooke Hogan finally decided to go. The trip to Clearwater had been on her mind for months, hovering like a page in her life she hadn't yet turned. She had been to the city since her father's death for meetings, for quiet beach visits, but she had never walked the path through Sylvan Abbey Memorial Park to the small, polished headstone that bore his name. For a long time, she told herself it wasn't necessary. She'd already said her goodbye, standing on the beach with the waves carrying her letter out to sea. But as the years turned quietly forward, something shifted. The work with Beyond the Spotlight had brought her closer to people who knew her father, people who missed him in ways she didn't expect, and it had softened some of the edges that grief had sharpened in those early days. Now, she wasn't going to the gravesite for closure. She had found that already. She was going because she could. The morning sun slanted through the moss-hung oaks as she drove through the gates. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and salt drifting in from the bay. Stephen was with her, holding her hand as they walked the narrow path between rows of headstones. The twins, now toddlers, stayed behind with Brooke's mother. The closer they got, the quieter she became, the world shrinking until all she could hear was the soft crunch of gravel under her shoes. Then there it was. A simple stone, not grand or flashy, set with his full name, Terry Jean Bollea. Beneath it, just 3 words, "Forever the champ." For a moment, she didn't move. She let the silence stretch, feeling the breeze tug at her hair, hearing the faint rustle of palm fronds above. It struck her that this was the first time she had been this close to him since before the estrangement, closer than at any tribute show, any panel, any event. And yet, she didn't feel the weight of regret she thought might crush her. Instead, she felt something calmer, something like acceptance. She knelt down and brushed away a few stray leaves that had blown across the grass. She didn't speak right away, but when she did, her voice was quiet, almost conversational. "Hi, Dad. I know it's been a while." She told him about the twins, how Oliver had inherited her stubborn streak and Molly had a laugh that could stop strangers in their tracks. She told him about the foundation and how it had grown bigger than she ever dreamed, how people from all over the wrestling world had come together to support it. She told him she'd been working hard to honor the good in his legacy, and that, even though they hadn't ended perfectly, she carried the best parts of him with her. When she finally stood, she placed a